So in August of 2013, Christian apologist and preacher Dustin Segers was interviewed by Christopher Maute on Meeting of the Minds, and he had a few things to say about logic. Let's listen.
The laws of logic are propositions, at least the basic laws, are like, for instance, the law of non-contradiction.
There's three basics, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Are laws that hold necessarily. That
Okay.
in other words, it has to exist.
For those of you who don't know, Dustin Segers is a presuppositional apologist and is explaining the transcendental argument for the existence of God in this interview, also known as TAG. Dustin, unlike some presuppositionalists I know, seems like a very nice and sincere guy, so my tone in this video will not be the accusatory one I would normally use when deconstructing a presuppositionalist. My first point of contention in this interview is his claim that the laws of logic exist. The laws of logic don't exist in the same sense that a sandwich, a diamond, or a waffle exist. They are merely descriptions of the world derived from our observations of the logical behavior of matter and energy. In this universe, a rock is a rock, and not a non-rock. Remember, the laws of logic are not the same thing as the reality that they describe.
How do you have an immaterial proposition that exists universally, that exhibits intentionality?
The problem I have with this question is that he is assigning a nature to the laws of logic. The laws of logic do not have a nature. The laws of logic are a nature. They are the nature of reality, and again, they do not exist as objective items. They do not exhibit intentionality. They merely describe. To his credit, Dustin is right that a mind is needed to formulate the statement A equals A, or something equals itself. But this does not mean that a mind is needed for an object like a Big Mac or a toaster to be itself. And by the way, what examples do we have of minds without physical brains or physical sources? I don't think we have any. Make note of this. Dustin has detached the concept of a mind from its conventional meaning in order to fit his God in for this definition.
There are no professional logicians who claim that logic is an emergent property of the human brain. The debate is between those who think logic is real, in other words, it exists independent of the human mind, and what are known as the constructivists.
This is so confusing because Dustin Segers is now making tiny allusions to a philosophy known as Platonic realism, an ancient idea that essentially borders on nonsense. Platonic realism is the idea that numbers, concepts, scientific laws, and the like possess some existence unto themselves. But this idea is absurd. All that's being claimed, at least by me, is that the laws of logic are simply abstractions based on the behavior of the universe. The laws of logic are simply truths about the behavior of reality. They do not exist independent of our minds, but that does not mean that if all minds disappeared, objects would cease to be themselves, that is, be themselves and something else at the same time and in the same way.
The majority view on both sides, and this is getting more into the issue of logic being an emergent property of the physical universe, the majority versus just the human brain, the physical brain.
Sure.
The majority view on both sides is that logic is based on set theory. Sets are foundational to math and logical systems. However, logic is necessarily used in set theory, so the debate is a bit tricky.
I disagree.
I wouldn't quite take this view. I think mathematics is based on set theory, as the operations are operations on sets, but I believe that logic is more foundational. Let's look at the first two laws of logic. Number one, the law of identity. The law of identity says that A is A. Something exists, it has a nature, and that nature is that it is what it is. Number two, the law of non-contradiction simply says that A cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same sense. Truth is not self-contradictory. Both of these laws include the variable A, which can represent any quantity or object. The variable A is being used in the singular sense. Both laws are simply abstractions that we humans make based on our perceptions of discrete objects. This is not to say that the laws do not apply to pluralities as effectively. It's just to say that we did abstract both of those laws from our perceptions of objects in discrete and individual forms and extrapolated them to pluralities as well. Our generalizations, universalizations, abstractions, extrapolations, and other grand inferences stem ultimately from our continuous observations of certain consistencies on a unary level. That is, our continuous perceptions of reality as a conglomerate of discrete physical objects.
Does our materialist friend want to say that sets are also emergent properties of matter?
Sets are emergent from matter, be it sets of bikinis, birds, boxes, or bunnies. All of these objects emerge from matter.
That would be odd, since sets are the basis of our math, which can't be emergent from matter. Again, there are no mathematicians who would say that sets are emergent properties of matter.
I'm tired of belaboring this point, so I'll let YouTube user Evidence explain.
One of the criticisms leveled at the thesis of evidentialism by many atheists was that some beliefs are true, but not based on physical evidence. One of the most common examples was mathematics. Math, they claim, is a purely rational activity. It has no basis in evidence. Mathematics is based on proofs, and proofs are purely rational. Let's examine this claim. The generally accepted basis for all of mathematics is set theory. For example, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Set theory discusses sets, which are well-defined collections of objects. But where does the idea of sets itself come from? I think the evidence indicates that the origin of the idea of sets is pretty clearly the physical universe. Without a physical universe containing collections of discrete objects, how would we abstract the idea of sets? Imagine we lived in a universe where there were no discrete objects, where all things oozed and melded into each other. How would we ever abstract the idea of sets in such a universe? Or imagine that our brains were initialized into a blank empty space. How would we ever abstract the idea of sets if there was nothing to collect? From sets, we can abstract the idea of numbers, which are labelings of specific set sizes. From numbers, we can abstract the idea of addition, which is the combination of subsets. Subtraction, which is the removal of subsets. Multiplication, which is the duplication of a single set a specific number of times to form a superset. Division, which is the uniform distribution of a single set into a specific number of subsets. Squares, which are the multiplication of a number times itself. Square roots, which are the inverse of this operation. Infinity, which is the abstraction of imagining what would happen if we started adding and never stopped. Negative numbers, which are an abstraction from positive numbers by imagining they stretched into infinity in the opposite direction. And because when two square roots of the same number are multiplied, they reproduce that number, we can then abstract to the idea of an imaginary number, the square root of -1. Abstractions of abstractions of abstractions. This is what mathematics is. And the abstractions of mathematics are only possible because we live in a universe of discrete physical objects, which can be grouped into sets. Without those objects, we never would have had anything to abstract from. Over time, we've had to formalize our abstractions based on other abstractions because of paradoxes we discovered in still other abstractions. This has caused us to periodically return to our mathematical foundations and modify them. But I think that the basic ideas of mathematics pretty clearly derive ultimately by abstracting from physical evidence. And this has proven very fruitful for us as a species when isomorphisms between our abstractions and the physical universe allow us to return to the physical universe and apply our abstractions to engineering applications.
What would the materialist argument that this proposition, i.e. that there is no possible world, such that there are no things that are, I'm going to have to skip that because that gets really complicated.
All right,
yeah, let me skip to something that's a little more easy to understand.
I'm not that smart, bro. I'm not that smart.
Well, and it's not just that. You're an intelligent gentleman, but not having this in front of you and not reading from it while I'm reading from it is, it's just, that gets way too difficult.
It's a little technical.
Yeah, let me go down a little bit because I make some points here that I think are more direct and a little easier to understand while, as I'm reading. You tell me, stop me or whatever.
Okay.
He says also, why does our friend think that logic is a property of matter, and is it all matter or just a certain configuration of matter?
Again, it's not logic that's a property of matter. Being logical is a property of matter. It is the behavior of matter.
Emergent properties of matter says that when you get a certain complex of matter, then you get that emergent property. So wetness isn't an emergent property of hydrogen or oxygen. It's an emergent property of just the right amount of hydrogen and oxygen molecules. So what is the complex of matter that logic emerges from? And what scientific articles have been written to show this? That's a good question.
I'm not even going to address the point about wetness because it's not relevant here. All matter is what it is and isn't what it isn't. This is true from everything from corks to quills to quilts. This is the behavior of matter regardless of the configuration. Even in the case of temporal change between entities like explosions and reionizations, matter still retains its logical behavior. Dustin's fundamental problem is simply a semantic issue. He's talking about logic as though it's a thing unto itself, when really it's just a descriptive tool.
Moreover, arguments themselves have certain logical properties like validity, invalidity, soundness, etc. But it doesn't have the property logic, for there is no such property. What does it mean then to say that validity is an emergent property of matter?
Okay, now Segers has jumped ship. He's equivocated the behavior of the physical universe, the consistent behavior of the physical universe, with our conceptual abstraction based on that behavior, and now he's gone to the applications of those conceptual abstractions as they're used in argumentation and proof. Validity and soundness are merely the applications of our logical abstractions. The reason for this is because if I'm going to make an argument for something in reality, my argument must be logical, ultimately because reality, as I've pointed out, is logical. Because reality is logical, whatever I refer to in reality must also be logical. If I have a theory of chemistry that says an atom of sodium must both be a sodium atom and a Korean toilet at the same time and in the same way, my theory fails because it's illogical.
Isn't P versus P, isn't if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q, always invalid? Why think that that form loses the property of being invalid if matter ceased to exist? That would be odd.
That's because the applications of our logical abstractions are based on the existence of matter. Logical principles would have no meaning if matter did not exist. The principle Segers is talking about in this specific example is modus ponens, which, as YouTube user Evidence explains, has a material basis for abstraction.
But what about logic? Logic isn't based on evidence, is it? And mathematics is based on logic. On the contrary, I think it is pretty clear that logic also is ultimately just an abstraction of physical experience based on physical evidence. Let's take modus ponens, for example. If A, then B. A, therefore B. This is so abstract. How could this possibly be based on physical experience? The answer? The evidence of physical causation. If it rains, I get wet. If I touch fire, I get burned. If I drop this glass, I will break it. A little reflection reveals just how ubiquitous this concept is in physical experience, and just how easily we could abstract it from physical evidence. This is strong evidence that the concept of modus ponens is just an abstraction of physical experience. I think the extreme irony of this situation is that we have experienced so much evidence for these abstractions that we no longer need evidence to remember and apply them. And so we find ourselves under the illusion that they are self-evident. But if you ever need a reminder that these statements are not self-evident, just walk into a kindergarten classroom and start spouting them as self-evident truths and expect the children to remember and understand them. You will likely be reminded very quickly that these are not self-evident truths. They are abstractions based on physical evidence. And if you want people who have not yet experienced the evidence for these abstractions to comprehend, remember, and believe them, you must present the evidence for them.
And then my friend reminded me of something. He said, sadly, I think that many of our new atheist friends simply don't know much about matter, logic, and the logic of the matter, pun intended. Mm-hmm. They appear to be more content to find intellectual smokescreens to deny the God with whom they have to do than they are in being intellectually rigorous. Some people can't be debated with because they don't know enough to know how much they don't know. Again, no logician or mathematician that I or my philosophically astute PhD philosophy friend student that I've discussed this with knows of any scholar who makes the claim that, logic is an emergent property of matter.
Oh, a parking ticket! I was gone 5 minutes! Oh, how could this day get any worse? Oh my God.